is the first rodent webinar that we've had, and hopefully it won't be the last. It's something that every pest control company deals with, and I've got two of the best people in the country, if not the world, here talking this morning. So our first speaker up this morning is Dr. Bobby Corrigan. Bobby is an urban rodentologist, is what he calls himself, and very apropos. Dr. Corrigan, he's been active as a scientist in urban rodent control for over 25 years. He works as a consultant who specializes in addressing complex rodent issues on both a national and international scale. He was a member of the Purdue University Entomology Department for 16 years as a teacher and researcher in rodent control, and that's where I got to know Bobby. His industry experience includes 3 years full-time as a pest control technician in New York City, very challenging area. He's co-author of several books in pest control and has written over 150 articles addressing the control of rodents. He's blogged for the New York Times, has been in Time magazine, has appeared in numerous TV shows and radio programs addressing the control of city rat populations. In 2008, he was inducted to the Pest Control Hall of Fame. Dr. Corrigan has an AAS degree in pest control from the State University of New York, a BS in urban entomology, and his master's and PhD degrees in rodent control from Purdue University. Bobby kind of splits his time between Indiana and an apartment in New York City. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Corrigan. And Bobby, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. And I guess it's hello to everyone, depending on where you are on the earth. But I especially want to say hello to our guests from India, Mexico, Canada, Puerto Rico. And so it's an honor to have this opportunity to talk about rodents. And I'm going to address, as you can see here on the slide, I'm just going to pick 10, I'm not saying it's the only 10, but 10 of the more essential rules for performing great rodent control. And so I as a scientist, I'm out a lot in the field, constantly looking at rodent issues and how they interact with our buildings and our, commodities and the problems they cause and so forth. And in fact, if right after this webinar today, I will be back out looking at some rodent issues. And I always find it fascinating. I hope everyone in this webinar appreciates the complexity, as I'll mention in a moment, about rodents. So if we jump in here right away, I do want to at least state the case that we are going to be talking about rodent infestations inside and around buildings specifically. Of course, there's many different types of rodent issues, and we just talking about urban rodents is our goal for today. Kind of a first word from our sponsor. Everybody knows the rodents of city areas and building areas are rats and mice. They're always getting into trouble, if you will, with us. Sometimes it's quite alarming. Everyone knows that rodents can be significant in diseases. They can be significant in chewing on wires, and gnawing on wires. And here, for example, is just one common case. It was all over the internet, not too long ago. But you can see a New York bound flight was delayed for 5 hours once the pilots discovered a mouse inside the cockpit. The pilots, of course, and let me just get a pointer here going, and you can see that, the spokesperson said, well, certainly we don't want a rodent running around our airplane because we're concerned about wires and cables. And so it's those kinds of things where, we always want to make sure that rodents don't have much of a presence in around our buildings for a lot of reasons. If we start out here, before we start into some rules, you can see, as I have there, scientific research is constantly proving overall that we've underestimated the behavioral complexities and sophistication of rodents. And everyone listening here today, for example, you yourselves could just Google any topic you wish. You could put rodents and food behavior. You could be rodents and genetics, and rodents and foraging, and you would be welcomed into a world of research that would take months and months of study to get through. But the bottom line with this is we are learning as we go here. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Time magazine dedicated their entire issue to the whole concept of we've underestimated other animals. And so you can see here in Time magazine, the whole front cover, and they're very careful the way they put these covers together, as you can imagine. But you can see it says what animals think. And every word there is very carefully selected. But it does say, as you can see about that cute pug dog, new science reveals they're smarter than we realize. And I think that kind of sets the stage for where we are in rodent control and rodents. And so as I have here, this is a science. Rodentology is the study of rodents, of course, just like entomology is the study of arachnids and insects and so forth. And those of us here today, we're, again, specifically interested in the cities and buildings and structures. So it's urban rodentology. It's a complex area. Again, just to put us in a frame of mind, we have to appreciate these animals. They make up 43% of all the mammals on this earth. 43%. That's an incredible number. I mean, another 7% would essentially mean 1 out of every 2 mammals on earth is going to be a rodent. Many scientists and mammalogists, when they're asked the ranking of the most successful mammals on the planet, I'm saying mammals specifically, of course, it comes out as the human, the house mouse, number 2, Norway rat, number 3, right? So this is what we're up against. When someone says, well, how much money will it cost for you to take care of the, say, roof rats in my warehouse? That's an important question that we have to pause and think about. Well, how sophisticated is my program going to be? Because laying down, if you will, a snap trap or a glue trap or what have us, a bait station, and then simply checking on a monthly basis, if there is a problem, that's probably not going to be matching the rodent issue. And what we've learned over the years, and many people, especially the pest professionals here today with this session, what it really comes down is to we need strategic strikes. It doesn't mean they have to be overdone or over-engineered, but we certainly cannot just lay down tools and see what happens and expect our customers to be satisfied. Most times when we have callbacks, when I have there, we suffer callbacks and our clients are unhappy with callbacks. I could put them into 2 big categories. One is we have a missed target application of our equipment. In other words, we put the equipment there, but because perhaps we didn't inspect it early enough, we miss. Secondly is if we are using, baits, for example, which we'll talk about today and Claudia will talk about, many times one of the biggest mistakes we make is we underapply those baits and traps as well. And the reasons for those is sometimes we just have not got a full appreciation of the infestation we're up against. So this session and the 10 essential rules I'm about to go through with you guys is about these strategic strikes. And, we all realize that, especially those of you that are in the business of pest management, we walk this very thin line, and it's difficult between running a business and keeping prices competitive and getting stops done, and at the same time, making sure we get them done effectively. And we can do that through a strategic strike thinking as we go along. So let's get started here. Number 1, and I just want to build on what I just mentioned, and that is if you're going to be doing rodent control, you have to stay up to date in research and biology behavior. And certainly that applies to every urban pest. So that's no surprise, and now we have the power of the internet and journals and industry magazines right off the top of your computer, so it's very, very convenient to stay up to date. And again, for the pest professionals here, this biological knowledge is in fact power. and thus it means more profits, more money in your pocket. Right? So it's a situation when we look at an animal like this. Here we have this generic rat, happens to be the roof rat. And you can tell by its very long tail and its big ears and its pointed snout. This is not a discussion on Rodent 101, but you're looking again, what seems to be just an ordinary rodent, if you will, if there is such a term, is a very, very complex animal, and research is constantly coming in as to how complex its behaviors are. I do want to point out, for example, right here, if we start at the muzzle, rodents have a great sense of smell. They have a great sense of taste. You'll notice, for example, as we go around the head here, they have these are called vibrissae coming out of the snout, vibrissae coming out of the top of the head, and each of these vibrissae have different functions that are very, very important to these animals. And so it's not as simple as, they have whiskers that they feel with. These are actually considered nervous organs, and the animal collects information with these vibrissae depending on where on the body they're located, and they make decisions. And I'm using that word based on research, is they gather information, and based on that information of smell, taste, sight, and sound, and touch, with those vibrissae, they may decide whether or not, for example, to go into a bait station, or to interact with a particular surface, or to jump over a particular part of surface. So these animals are very, very complex, and we just want to keep that in mind as we work with them. Here's some examples, just a few. I mean, there's many I could have put up here, but just in the past 5 years, if you keep up with the research, we realize that now we know the Norway rat's home range is not what we used to think. We thought it was 50 to 100 feet, for example. And now we know it's more typically 90 to 450. Right? We know house mice, just recently in the past couple of years, has been shown that when house mice are within structures, they have particular areas and zones and tight squeezes, thus called squeeze points, that they like to travel through for different reasons, including just to travel through them so they get constant reinforcement of understanding their world. And so they squeeze through these, they go through these gymnastics as they squeeze through them. And by doing that, they're able to reinforce their particular home range and their area and their particular travel pathways. And it's fascinating. And that becomes important when you do inspections for house mice and where to put down, say, mouse traps or bait stations or glue traps or what have you. And third, there is just another quick example. Again, rodent vibrissae are highly sensitive organs, and they're used for navigation, avoiding dangerous surfaces, making daily decisions. Right? So that's all just 3 examples. We could put 20 examples here, but the point is, if you're in the business of rodent pest management, it's a complex area. And here again, I use this quick diagram just to show, and the reason I put this one in here is how the artist, through pen and ink, chose to very strongly show the vibrissae just in the head region alone. You have long vibrissal hairs there, and you have short ones. You have ones that are shorter on the head and long on the head. And all of those hairs have a very specific purpose. And again, it may seem simple that you put down a device or a bait station or something, when in fact to this animal, all kinds of behaviors are going to be associated with that bait station or trap. Just recently, about a year ago to this webinar, here we see Time Magazine summarizes some fascinating research, again back to the complexity, but rats regret even making bad decisions. And you can see in that picture there, which is wonderful, how they backlit that rat. You can see the length and prominence of those vibrissae. All right, so rule number 2 then is, and you probably can put this together just as what we went through, but it's very critical for reducing callbacks and getting control. But rodents and their colonies, and quote, the infestation, whenever we go out to do a management, they don't have standards. So, you can see their home ranges vary, food choices vary, their activity periods vary, and the exterior rodent pressure on the building that you're working in varies. So the point is, when we get to these situations, we as professionals and trained in this science, it's up to us to make the call at each and every site. We can't go from, say, one food store to another, constantly saying, well, all mice have a home range of, 10 to 30 feet. We can't go from one building to another, an office building to a supermarket. Those home ranges are going to be drastically different for these animals. So for each of the species you work with, some of you work with roof rats, ratus, some more with Rattus norvegicus, and probably all of us work with house mouse. But the point is, when you get there, the slate is clean until you analyze the situation, and that's what I'm going to focus on. It's important, especially to consider, we grew up with some myths associated with rodents that we are now somewhat throwing out. But rodent colonies, your colony, my colony, anywhere you want to work, if you go in and let's just pretend that there's 100 mice using a particular building, of those 100, some of those mice will not follow the walls. Some are not even going to visit the floor if they have options. And number three, and I think everyone that's had any experience in rodent control can attest, some rodents tend to be very secretive, and they're the ones we end up giving a simple term called smart rats, or the smart ones. But among a 100 group of rodents infesting buildings, you'll have a percentage that are simply, for very complex reasons that we don't have time to go into here, let's just call them secretive. They're secretive, and they're not going to chance or visit whatever we put down. And that's where our callbacks tend to come in. Here's an example. I'm in a crawl space. When I took this picture, it was pitch black. What I want to point out is there's actually a rat right here disappearing. As I entered the pitch black crawl space, this rat was running away, of course, from my area, but his path and all his colony members' path was very deliberate. You'll see here, all these are high points of rocks in the crawl space. They're all heavily marked with rodent sebum, the grease marks off their bodies, and urine and feces. And basically, these are pheromones that allow these animals to constantly navigate and communicate with each other. The point to take home from this is just one example. Whereas if you look all the way to the right over here, you don't see the trail. You don't see the sebum trail. You don't see the constant rodents and so forth. So the point is, for each job with rodents, if we're going to do professional rodent control, then it's up to us to first analyze these situations and then implement the control based on the analysis. Once rodents are inside, we do have these guidelines. And for now, until research adds to it, but this is what we do have in our standard textbooks. Mice, for example, once inside, it's a general guideline that, from the nest, 10 to 30 feet, Norway rat 50 to 100, and a roof rat greater being 1 to 300. The general rule, no matter what the distances are, because you can see I have plus minus after every single one of those, at least we should have an idea, something to give us a basis from which. So those numbers there, are workable, but they're totally open to the resource. In general, for example, rodents like to be close to their food, and once they discover the food source that's reliable, then they like to take the shortest distances from their nest to that food source. So obviously, let's just say if we pick on our buddy, the Norway rat, the Norway rat's living behind a dumpster, behind a bakery with that dumpster, that home range for that Norway rat in that dumpster shed or something might, for the most purposes, be 10 feet, right? So that's what we mean about there's no standards. Well, rule number 3 is just a quick comment here. What this all leads up to is if you're a pest professional, if you're anyone involved with animal populations and especially urban pest populations, we really have a prerequisite to our jobs, and that is you have to be trained to see what everyone else overlooks. Most people have no idea, of course, about the behavior of roaches and ants, and now we have these mammals that research has shown to be pretty darn clever and can learn from bad experiences. So you have to be trained to pick up on that. The term for that, of course, is keen observers. And and that's essential. If you're involved in pest management, whether it's rodents or some other pests, you really have to be a keen observer instead of someone just looks around with a flashlight. It's up to us to take it to a higher level. So, translated, that means we have to be more investigators than applicators. And, I love the quote by Dr. Peter Cornwell, an urban entomologist, who said, "The success of your treatment depends on the detail of your inspection." And that applies to probably all aspects of pest management. If you want to get it done right, and I think you would hear every single speaker say this, when you're doing urban pest management, is put your time in the inspection and then figure out strategic strikes with whatever you're doing. Let's take that concept and let's use a simple one, a very, very simple question with rodents. If, say, a client came up to us or a person said, "Well, you're the rodent expert, can you tell me, yes or no, just by looking at that hole, that rodent hole in the wall, the curb, or beneath the bush, is that currently being used?" And that's a question, for example, almost a gut check question that, perhaps, we should ask ourselves, can I tell, yes, it's obviously a rodent hole, but is it active? And actually, it's a pretty simple way, way to do that. But let's use real world. I took these pictures just a couple of weeks ago in a rodent scenario I was involved with. But you'll see my orange arrow over here to the left points to all the sebum trails and tail drags of the rats going over the sheetrock. And my red circle over here is those are hollow tile blocks within a building, and the rats were simply infesting most of that wall, being that they're little condominiums for each of them. But just looking around with my flashlight, it was pitch black in this ceiling space, but I can see where the sebum leads, and I can then get closer. For example, here we are very up close and personal to that ceramic tile. And you can see, if you're a little bit of this investigator that I'm talking about, how all of a sudden the metal is stained here versus the shine of this metal nearby and here, because it's smeared with rodent sebum, the grease or whatever you would like to call it. It's the grease off the bodies of the animals. So, and they were certainly entering, if you'll notice here, that hole, the edges of that hole gets dark. You begin to zero in on where these animals are active. Here's an easy example. This is in a distribution center containing food that, was sent back on a regular basis. But this whole support cavity, and this is concrete hollow block as well, is covered in sebum. But you clearly see the trail of the mice entering into it. Sometimes people say, well, how do you know that's not old? How do you know that's not old smears? And as an investigator, I will tell you that all you would have to do is scrape through that dark sebum right here or up here with a knife or a spatula. And if you're able to scrape some of that off, that's fresh, because sebum does not remain in a layer like that for very long. It wears down. So right there, you're a keen observer as to what's going on. If we take a simple hole in the ground, this is a hole in the curb in the side of a city street, you'll see the rodent hair here. As the rodents come and go, they lose their hair against rough surfaces. You see all of this area right here is stained with sebum, and that, in fact, is an active hole. Hairs have gravity, of course, they're blown away, they drop down, they're not going to last. So right there is a very simple example of just being a keen observer versus looking casually. Well, the reality is you don't have time to take every single building and be a Sherlock Holmes, if you will, in every single building, foot by foot. That's just the reality of what I mentioned earlier, is we're in business, and the customer's not going to pay for us to dissect everything inch by inch unless there's a problem. So I like to use keywords, and that's my fourth rule here. But these keywords are based on rodent biology and behavior. When I get to an account, instead of going and looking at every single wall and every single thing and hoping I'll see rodent droppings, I go in with a very specific group of words that helps me save time. And these are my favorite words, not the only ones. But when we're doing keen observation exercises to solve rodent problems quickly, you need some help. So the words I like to work with are, as you can see here, lines, corners, warmth, voids. In fact, if you're in pest management, I like to joke around, but I'm serious at the same time. You have to be a voidologist. You have to know all your voids, and you have to know how they work and what they're for and where they go. And because that's what the ants do, that's what the roaches do, that's what the rodents do, is you need to know what that void is for, and you need to know everything about it, and then you're in their world. Of course, shadows, many times you just let your eyes fix on areas that are dark and areas where rodents have been reported. Once you go to those dark areas, you're going to be like the rodents. That's where their brain takes them, because they're prey species. They do not want to be visible to their predators. And then lastly, especially for those of you who work with roof rats, wood. The element of wood in rafters, studs, joists, support beams, sill plates, and so forth has a whole tight connection, ecologically and physiologically speaking, with these animals. And we'll just leave that there for now, but that alone could be several seminars. Well, if you look at just a couple of these key words, here's a line from rats in a city environment. This happens to be New York City. This park is heavily, heavily infested with rats. And you will see the line through the ground ivy. This is the rat trail. And the ground ivy is, of course, missing. It's like deer when they pass constantly through a wooded area, they lose their path. So this is heavily traveled by rats every single night, and I watch them personally come through here. The point to take home from this, for example, by doing your keen observation, the rats were not running along the perimeter fence. And the reason that's important is because that's where the pest professionals would set up the bait stations, and they would always say, well, the rats are afraid of our new bait stations. Well, the fact of the matter is they weren't afraid of new bait stations. The bait stations just weren't put in the right place. And research has shown if you miss by 10 feet, just 10 feet, with bait stations, rats may never, ever know your bait stations are there. So the point is, through a good inspection and keeping an eye out for things, you must bring the products to the rodents because they may not come to you even though you're thinking they're running along walls and what have you. Here's a line penetrating through concrete hollow block, and what drew me to that particular scene was, in fact, it's a line. I didn't look up there per se as, well, let me look in the dark corner. It's a line, that particular line penetrating through the block, but now we have a couple things coming together. We have a line, we have a penetration, and we have a void, and you can see all the clear evidence. This is all beautiful, fresh, sebum that pretty much spells the whole story out. And you can see as the rodents run right up here and they make a sharp turn, their backs hit the top of the ceiling here as they duck down into their condominiums of the concrete hollow block. Which, and by the way, I'll throw this in right here. If you're ever dealing with rodents and it's a complex situation and you're on callbacks, the first thing is to analyze your walls. Wall type. Is it block? Is it solid concrete? Is it wood, stud, and plasterboard? But that is absolutely critical. So here we have a corner response. Dr. Dawn Gouge, some of you probably know Dawn, took this picture while visiting us in New York City working on rats a couple of years ago in a rat academy. And she took this beautiful corner response of Radis novegicus pushed up against the corner. You can see it's in a classic posture. Animals love to touch three surfaces, both walls, of course, and the floor. And again, just like the wood comment, we could spend an hour just on the corner response of rodents and why they love corners. But suffice to say for here that you should always look in corners when doing rodent control work for places to put bait stations and snap traps. It's not a place for glue boards, by the way, but it is a great place for snap traps and bait stations. Here I took this picture with Tim the Dairy and working with Tim one time in a restaurant in New Orleans, in fact, in the French Quarter, since you're going to hear from Claudia Rigel in a moment. But we're upstairs in a mezzanine area above a restaurant, and rodents clearly speak to us as to their corner responses here. And everyone should know that, especially the rats, they have pheromones within their fecal pellets that do communicate to other rats. When they've been successful in an area, their pheromones may say, stop here, eat here, rest here, visit here. And so you can see the corner responses of this rat family here. But I have to also say that, in this particular inspection, found very little control materials placed where the droppings were. They were just placed around the perimeter of the walls in the building and the outside. Okay, so here we have a scenario where, we have the wood, we have the concrete hollow block, we have the lines. We're building on this scenario that when you're out there being the keen observer, things come together and you begin to see the pattern, and now you realize, well, what are the scenarios? Where are the rodents and what are their favorite issues? So that's, just one area where the lines come together and the wood comes together and the voids come together. When you get to the shadows, especially, you want to keep in mind those quiet, warm areas, rodents, especially during the winter time, when they move indoors and what have you, they're looking for warmth. So where the shadows develop, where it's quiet, warm, and humans, we have this particular thing we actually encourage rodents, and that is as simple as a cardboard box. And so, I have here, for example, just mice, particularly in cardboard boxes. That's a perfect fit for them. They love it because the boxes deaden their sounds. They give them great insulation. They keep them separate from dominants and subordinates. They need their space and for all kinds of reasons, just like we do. And the cardboard, takes on the odor of their pheromones. And certainly, there's a lot of cardboard. Again, this is a real world example. You see now concrete hollow block, and on the top, people doing their typical thing, out of sight, out of mind, with all the stuff we accumulate as a species. And those boxes were loaded with mice, but yet all on the floor were multiple catch traps and glue boards and so forth, and with occasional small captures, but not getting at the root of the problem because everyone was just walking by those, including the pest technician on this. Rule 5, remember that all three species are secretive, again, and set the stage for that. I want to stress that a myth out there is, that the roof rats are the most secretive of all the animals, and in fact, that could be true, but all three have these secretive animals, and so we have to get into areas such as those ceilings. And once you're in those secret zones, then stay close to the foundation walls above any warmth, and especially with rats, nearest their water source. Okay, so the take home here, for example, here is a convenience store, and it's classic for those of you that do commercial accounts. The action is in some of those boxes way back up here in the corner, right here, and have right up to the ceiling. These ceiling panels that rodents can easily gnaw through and come and go for a quick, completely covered travel down to the floor and out to where there's some food being spilled. So, and if we go into the ceiling, I'm going to go right into the ceiling with you right now. You can see, there it is. That's the ceiling, and you can look at this and see all the wood, the cross members, the pipes, the conduits, the cabling. All of this together. There's hundreds of highways. And we can all relate to this. Just think of our busy highways with all the exit ramps and the way it loops around. And we get onto different highways and then onto a different highway. It's the same for rodents in this kind of scenario. Way in the background here where the pointer is, that's concrete hollow block with wood on top of it. And this particular situation was a chronic mouse complaint. And I guess I have to stress here, being with these secretive animals, the bulk of the work is not on the floor. The bulk of this work is not to put down more and more and more glue traps, the more and more complaints come in, or snap traps. It is hard work. You have to access the rodents here. And that's actually just by following their pheromones and a heavy dropping sign and stolen equipment here. The point is, this takes time. And then obviously, when we give the customer the price of, look, I have to work for 3 hours in your ceiling space, which is hard to get around and up and down ladders, they often are dismayed and upset with the labor price we have to get it. But that's what it takes in these kinds of accounts. Or here's a much more simpler, or yet the same principle, that the maintenance guy is working with us, taking off panel after panel to give us access to all these areas below the refrigerant. It's warm down there, it's dark down there, there's compressor motors and deep dark shadows and protection from all the predators. You have to access these animals there. Again, just putting out traps and bait stations around the perimeter of this room, which quite frankly was done for years. And they kept firing each pest control company saying, you cannot get control. Well, this guy, quite frankly, is the key to control, working with the pest professional. But we can't wait for the rodents to come to us. We have to get to them. So here we clearly see an example, right here of sebum trail by rats. These happen to be Norway rats running this wall. And you can see the droppings at each of the corners, especially over here. And, those are the areas we'd have to focus in on. Number 6 is when attempting to control a current infestation or prevent future ones, we really do want to know what's on the outside. We call that pressure. What's the rodent pressure on that building? Which sides, for example, have the natural habitat. And the reason this is so important is obviously if we're controlling rodents inside a building or around the immediate proximity of a building, and we're not paying attention to what's coming in, it will go on forever. It'll be bailing out the ocean with a teaspoon kind of thing. So we at least want to be aware of is there a reservoir, for example, of rodents affecting the building. So we can see here in this corner heavy, dense vegetation, and that, without much trouble, if you just take a little bit of a look, as I'm going to show you, has a reservoir of mice. And those mice follow these fences and dark shadow areas, and they're constantly impacting a building very close by, just 30, 40 yards away. And so if we go looking, if picking up bushes and moving aside grasses and this kind of thing, you'll see sometimes these globular straw nests, almost like bird nests, but covered over. And that's classic house mice. They don't need much. They only need the size of a grapefruit to have a family and live in that family and venture out for food from time to time. But again, those kinds of nests are easily found below vegetation and sometimes in the vegetation. House mice, roof rats will do the same thing. They'll build their nests up in trees, at the tops of fences, tucked within bushes, on the ground, and so forth. So the pressure's out there, and it's up to us to look at it. This is just a quick example. Sometimes you can just start with even Google Earth. I like to use Google Earth before I even show up an account. I'm looking at my problems and figuring out, okay, where's the pressure? And usually that's, you can see up here, for example, we have some vegetation with a railroad coming into this giant warehouse. Down here, I have a green corridor strip that's, from the way up here above. In a satellite, it doesn't look like much, but that's That's two trees on both sides of each other, all the way down, adding up to several hundred trees. Well, you have several hundred mice using those areas. They provide pressure to this distribution center. And the data show in all the multiple catch traps and bait stations along these rows, that's the heaviest influx. So how are you going to address that? And how are you going to compensate for that? And if you have the same number of bait stations or traps here versus the other side of the warehouse where there's no pressure, well then, we're wasting time in one area and not giving enough time in the other. So here's a kind of a elementary level. We've all done this. I don't need to take time here, but we can see we have dumpsters, we have a compactor. These areas, these are certainly going to attract rodents as well as other pests like crazy into this food. This is a food serving establishment. You'll see my red arrow here. We have a tree touching, and there was a roof rat problem here. Well, you put two and two together, and this tree, if this is a food establishment, that tree's got to go. Or it's got to be trimmed back by 6 feet at least, and these all have to be maintained correctly. All right, rule 7. And this one is one of actually, for me in my own career, I think is one of the most important and sometimes, and ironically, one of the most overlooked by both clients and the pest management industry. But pest, professional rodent proofing is, in the truest terms, within IPM, the smartest, most pure, and most cost-effective form of sustainable pest control that we can offer and implement. And, and sometimes it's so basic, it's so elementary, it's so step number one of everything that we look past and say, sure, but what's the best bait, right? And the fact of the matter is the best bait for rodent control is not to let them in the first place. So we have these obvious examples that I'm not going to waste time on. Every one of us has seen enough door thresholds that are in poor condition to last us a lifetime, perhaps. But you can see the sebum right here. Again, all this is fresh sebum telling us that, well, because this door is in such bad repair, that of course the rodent's going to come every single night to get into a garbage area and out back to the nest. So, but you look at the pest professional's service routine, and he says, I've told them 100 times to seal up that door, and they just don't listen, and they just keep expressing they want stronger bait. And that's the frustrations sometimes in pest control. Here we have a more common example. Again, this is the outside of a food facility, and right here, the maintenance crew, they felt that was tight enough. And the fact of the matter is, you can see the sebum leading up here behind this conduit and right through a hole in the concrete hollow block leading right into the building. And, that's got to be taken care of. We're inside a crawl space. We have a pipe, again, penetrating through concrete hollow block. And we know that we have to plug up the pipes that, plumbers and utility and cable people leave. But that's certainly not going to be lasting very long right there. Some people, they'll take soft copper mesh and they'll stuff it in there quickly and feel, well, because it doesn't rust, it's what we should use. But that shimmies out, and it's also, because it's such a soft metal, rodents will pull that with their teeth and push it with their paws, and there's no threat to them. There is new technology in the market these days where there's stainless steel, much more sophisticated types of mesh that can be stuffed in the holes, and it doesn't rust, and it locks and loads within the holes, and that technology is out there. So we're really in good shape these days with having the tools that we didn't have in years past. This is not acceptable. I think we've all been there, done this. Hopefully everybody's shaking their head at this, but this is a lay person's, an amateur's approach to keeping rodents out from coming in through pipes, which they were all around these pipes. There was just huge gaps. For example, here, this foam blob is, again, it's a lay person's attempt at something that needs to be done correctly, permanently, so it's done right. rodents will gnaw through that easily, and it's it's amateurish. It doesn't work. There is, just to close this discussion on exclusion, there is a particular group over the past several years that is now beginning to get into the science, believe it or not, of pest exclusion. And like anything else, pest exclusion also is its own world, its own science. So now there's a group called Scientific Coalition on Pest Exclusion. And you can, if you're interested in getting information, you can check out pestexclusion.org. But because it's so important, it's worth all of us staying up to date on this aspect. Okay, Rule 8, the sebum, the hair, the droppings. As we are doing our keen observation exercises and we're being the investigator, as I've set the stage here all along, basically the payoff there is everywhere you see these items, these rodent signs clearly, the payoff is the rodents are basically telling us where to install our equipment. If they're there, they'd say, well, what more information do you need? But again, if we're just putting it along walls at 30-foot spacings or 100-foot spacings, one, anybody can do that, and two, is it doesn't fit the science of these animals' behavior. So as they pointed out earlier, this clearly is a spot where a piece of equipment needs to go. But yet the nearest piece of equipment was about 25 feet away, just because it was a wall and easy to get to. But, the rodents would speak differently to us in those cases. Rule 9 and 10 here, as I'm going to finish up, I'm going to talk about just, a couple of key rules with trapping and a couple of key rules with baiting. Dr. Rigel, after me, is going to also mention some things about baits and traps and so forth. So I think between the two of us, we'll have the key points. But as you can see here, the Rule 9 is you must trap as a trapping professional, not as would a homeowner. And again, anyone can put down a snap trap. Any homeowner can go right to the hardware store today and pick up a mouse trap or a rat trap and, quote, put it down. And sometimes they get lucky, and sometimes they don't, of course. But trapping has behavioral complexities that those of us, have to pay attention. For example, and here's just a couple, but I have for trapping knockdowns, and specific knockdowns for both rats and mice. Number one is one that everyone gets uncomfortable with, especially in business, but it's absolutely, through good science, been shown, this is one of the smartest things you can do, is for both rats and mice. I want to stress this, not just rats. The smartest thing you can do is you begin your trapping program, and everyone needs to know you've begun the trapping program, but you start by pre-baiting. In other words, you don't set those traps for 3 to 5 days. One of the biggest mistakes is everyone goes in and put out a whole bunch of traps, a whole bunch of glue boards, and they come back and, yes, you've captured animals, but you've also trained some to avoid those devices like crazy. And they, again, will be your callback. You should pay attention to your juveniles. Number 2, pay attention to your juveniles as you capture them, because once you see juveniles in your traps, whichever trap you're using, it indicates you're not too far from the source of where those animals originated from. Juveniles just don't have the capacity for long distance travel away. Map out your captures. That's very smart. Nothing fancy, even on a piece of scrap paper, and then transfer it to something more formal. You don't need like a termite sheet or anything. But where are you capturing your animals? After you've had success for a week or so, the best thing to do is shut that down again for another 3 to 5 days of pre-baiting. Then you start the cycle back up, and you get this big spike, and that's the way you want to do it. And finally, you want to use nutritional balanced trapping strategy. It's a fancy term, just means, within, say, every 900 square foot setting, you have all 4 types of food groups. So the rodents living in that particular 900 square foot setting select among choices. If you put out 100 traps of peanut butter or 100 traps of chocolate, you're only selecting for peanut butter rodents or chocolate rodents. So you want to make sure you do that correctly. Here's just an example for, this is a real world example, but, on the right, you'll see 30 evenly spaced traps. It looks nice, it's pretty, the layperson thinks the whole building is covered. and everywhere the rodents go, so there's a trap waiting for them. But the reality is, the strategy on the left is the smart strategy. And you notice some areas have no traps because there's no rodents in those areas. And the area in yellow is where the heaviest concentration was. And notice I have a lot of traps there, where if you look back to the right, over here, there's only 3. So there's 3 when there should be, 17, 18 traps. And you'll go forever with complaints in those scenarios. Okay, rule 10, and I am going to cheat a little bit here, you guys. I'm going to cheat. I'm having a 10A and a 10B. It's just the way it had to go. But when using rodenticide baits, you have to use the right formulation for the right site. In other words, pellets for burrows, but not for bait stations. But then it reverses. You have blocks and soft baits for bait stations, but never for burrows. And there's laws now, and Claudia Rigel will talk a little bit about this, I believe, in her presentation, as to following your label. So here we have, of course, we have a bait station, and it's, in this case, it has soft bait. Sometimes it's critical you follow the best placement of where that bait station goes and keep those baits fresh. All right, and I'm going to finish here. With baits, you must closely adhere to the application rates, or face the pain of expensive callbacks and or canceling customers. So, for example, I have there on the bottom guesstimates of 1 or 2 ounces per burrow is way off if that's an active infestation. But sometimes I'll watch, a professional just, take a scoop or 2 or 3 packets or something and shove them down burrows and feel that's plenty. And that's usually radical underbaiting. So in summary, you want to do location based on investigation. And, the main message I brought here was you must bring your materials to the rodents instead of, and again, if this is infestation, this is not maintenance I'm talking about, instead of just putting stuff out along some line and then waiting each month for, the rodents to visit some of those. Lastly, I'll just share with you, and then I'll stop, but people are always asking me what new events are happening in rodents. In my world, there's 3 that you might be interested. One is every year in New York City, we have a rodent boot camp. It's 3 days intensive. We waive the tuition, but it's very intensive, 3 days and 1 day in the field, having solved real world rat problems. Second, people keep asking me, when will I have my rebuilt website back up? And I'm looking at the end of the summer. And then third is we've also been working on a correspondence course for the past year, and that'll be ready at the end of this year. If you have interest in that, just shoot me an email on any one of those 3, as you can see down below on the left, at cityratsicloud.com. Okay, so with that, I do want to say it was an honor to be here. I know a lot of work goes into these webinars behind the scenes, and they're really incredible, especially this particular series at the University of Georgia. So thanks, Dan and Jim and Gwen, for having me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. That's really, really good stuff. I appreciate that. So we have several questions, Bob, that have come in, and I'll take these in the order that we received them. There were a couple of questions that were posed at registration. The first one was, do rats gnaw things to wear their teeth down?
They do not. They gnaw on everything that they bump into, but they don't do it to keep the teeth gnawed down. They do it as an investigative behavior because they never know what they're going to get as a payoff by doing that. They keep the teeth filed down by grinding them against each other while they're resting. But and it's probably supplemented just when they do gnaw on things, they are getting the benefit of some tooth wear and keeping those muscles in shape.
Okay. The next question we have was a little bit longer, but could you please discuss the efficacy of traditional baits versus the newer vitamin D3 baits, for example, the types of baits, and any types of baits, and any.
Hello?
Jay, you have your phone, if you can close that down. Go ahead, Bobby.
So Yes, I understand the question. I'll just make a short comment, and I know Claudia Rigel is going to also mention this. But I think so far, what we've learned and what the marketplace certainly indicates is the second generation anticoagulants seem to be the mainstay of our rodent control programs around the world. And they seem to have the highest palatability. They seem to have the best benefits in many ways of how to get the job done. Occasionally, vitamin B3, to use that example, has its place in considering, sensitive situations where we don't want non-targets affected and so forth, especially in around bird areas and what have you. But so far, most cases, it's the efficacy and the research points to the anticoagulants being our best tool so far. But that doesn't mean it's the only tool in terms of baits.
Okay, Bobby, the next question was, what about water needs for rats and mice?
That's a great question. I would say this, for mice, it's not such a crucial thing, although you should always put that into your formula when you're doing rodent inspections. Mice can metabolize their own water, and they'll be okay if they don't have free water. Rats, it's a different ballgame, especially Norway rats. Whenever you're involved with Norway rats, you should always ask yourself, as I had in that one slide, where are they getting their water in addition to where are they getting their food? For Norway rats, that's essential. For roof rats, many times they can get their food. If there's any kind of fruits out there in the area where the roof rats are a problem, and slugs and snails, they can extract their water needs many times from those fruits and natural items. But there too, roof rats, they need water on a regular basis as well.
Okay, very good. Next question we had, what are the distinct characteristics that differentiate a fresh rodent dropping from an old rodent dropping?
Excellent. So the most important thing here is not color, and I want to stress that. Some people say, well, if it's shading dark and black, it's new, and if it's dusty and gray, it's old, and that only holds up in some scenarios. The most important thing you can do, fresh versus old, is if it's fresh, it's going to still be pliable usually, still have some moisture, and if you're in the temperate areas of the world and it's during the summer and you see them outdoors, it might even still be steamy. And so, that's fresh, obviously. So, but look for the moisture content. That's the most important thing.
Okay. Next question. Post-bait placement, how frequently should one check for activity?
If you're dealing with an infestation and it's ongoing and you've just finally got your baits down, my advice is you want a good handle on the reactions of that colony to what you did and to the bait. So within several days, and if you can, even if you can swing by there even on a daily basis and take a look at things, but certainly the beginning end of baiting, the first couple of days, a couple times maybe within the first week, and you'll get a pretty good clear picture of how frequently you need to go back following the first week. But the first week is critical in telling you a lot of good information. Once you're on a maintenance program, then in general, these baits, 4 to 5, 6 weeks, keeping them fresh. And the general rule is when in doubt, if you're on a maintenance program, on a monthly basis, you swap them out, needed or not basis, and keep them fresh.
Okay. Next question. Should we utilize liquid, solid, and tracking powder during a major infestation cleanout prior to exclusion work being performed?
Yes, but here's the thing, and that question is big time. But I would say this: when you talk about liquids and tracking powders, for example, the big jump now occurs in safety, especially tracking powders. Remember, anywhere you blow a tracking powder, and tracking powders, if it's anticoagulants or the zinc phosphide, it still takes time to kill these animals. So wherever these animals get these tracking powders on their bodies, before they're dying, they're traveling around that area they infested. You want to make sure that they're not carrying that tracking powder onto surfaces, any areas where people are going to touch it, anyone's desks, any food prep surfaces, any place where people can come in contact with it. It's not as though it would kill anyone instantly, but at the same time, it's a situation where no one wants poison dust or powder on them for any reason, or inhaled or anything like this. So those are tools. They can be used correctly according to label directions, strictly according to label directions. I would mention finally that tracking powders are the only restricted use pesticide.
So next question that came in was, when should I use neurotoxic or anticoagulant baits?
So please be very careful with any tracking powders. I'm not sure of that, but there is, in general, I'd say if you're going to be doing baiting in general for rodents, you know, again, the anticoagulant baits tend to be the mainstay of the baiting programs. Switching over, if you want to use one of the non-anticoagulant baits, such as bromethylene, and that's what you mean by the neurotoxins, since they do attack the nervous system, no, that's totally fine. But there's no rule right now. But I would say this: if you have long-term rodent control programs, especially in city areas where you're using lots and lots of bait each month, probably the smart thing to do to stave off resistance is to have a bait rotation schedule. And we don't have time, but you can go into the internet, and there's lots of good directions on rotation schedules, you know, on a regular basis.
Thanks a lot, Bobby.
Okay.
That was great job.
All right, thanks, Dan. And I'm comfortable with it within reason, and I don't know what the protocol is, but if people have questions they can get answered, I think you guys mentioned you'll facilitate that, or do we send them right to our email, or what?
Yeah, so I think we got to most of the questions there, Bobby, that were posed in the chat box, but I think if any of the other participants would like to pose additional questions, they can send them to me at dsuter@uga.edu, and I'll pass those on to you. Or if you left your email address there, Bobby, if you could repeat that, people would you mind if people emailed you directly?
No, I have no problem. I did list the email address there, you know, so, I mean, I can do it, but I just want to make sure I don't go outside your particular protocol. You may have reasons for wanting to channel the questions through you to get a survey response or something. I can go either way. All right?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Okay.
It's a great job. Great job. Fantastic webinar, Bobby. Thank you.
Thanks for the invite. I'll be here listening to Claudia.
Okay, very good.